All right. Welcome to Game Mastering 201, Understanding Campaign Management. This will be a part of a series, ongoing series on how to better refine, more refine your campaign and your GMing capabilities. In this particular workshop, and I'll just read it off here. It's a workshop on understanding your campaigns and campaign in terms of information control, information management, and organization. So we're going to kind of talk about the backside of your campaign as far as the information and stuff like that the players may not see, and what you're doing behind the scenes before a game, or stuff to manage your campaign as it's going along. One thing I'll say kind of straight out is that role-playing games are a fairly unique thing in the fact that, unlike a board game, you don't just flip out a role-playing game, put your pieces on the board and kind of set it up and play it, then pack it back. Role-playing games are a lot more versatile in that regard, but then again, a lot of role-playing games require a little bit of bookkeeping on the back end. And a lot of times, whenever you're playing, a campaign, you have to manage that campaign in such a way that everything seems to be consistent. All your data and your information are all together, and basically you can access it, or allow your players access of certain bits of data that you want them to look at. So we'll begin our slideshow. So we'll click over here and start it away. And basically, whenever we start up a campaign, we usually go through kind of a two-step process. First of all, whenever we start a campaign, we usually think about what kind of system we want to play, or what kind of genre we want to use. And typically, a lot of times we'll get that shiny new game like 5th edition D&D or something like that, and you'll read through the rules, get really excited, and really want to play something. It gets the creative juices flowing a little bit. And this is kind of the first step in creating a campaign. So it's very free form, very fluid. You're thinking about exactly what you want to do as far as your setting, or you're thinking about what you want to do to your players per se. What kind of challenges you want to have, present to them, or what kind of characters you'd like to see. You get really excited about that. So you tend to think about, visualize the cool scenes, the most exciting possibilities. Also, too, this is the time where you kind of have your rose-colored glasses on. And that is, whenever you're imagining this stuff, you're always imagining in the best-case scenario, or the most positive light. You're imagining how things would go if you were playing this game with your friends, and all the traps miraculously worked, or they fight against some monsters and stuff like that. But you kind of visualize that in your mind. Sometimes some GMs are pretty business-like also. You probably want to think about how long you want this game to run, whether or not you want to do like a season of about 6 or 8 games, or if you want to keep this game going for a year, 2, 3 years, or as long as you can make it. But that's kind of the first step of your creative process. And basically, it is very much the first step of your campaign management process, too, because you're thinking about what you want to do. The next thing that you tend to do, your second part of your two-step process, is documenting the ideas for your campaign. After you think about all this stuff, you really want to write this stuff down and make sure that everything is, copied down. Some people are really good about this, and they, copy their notes and stuff like that. Some people are a bit, prolific in their writing. They tend to write a lot of stuff. They write, huge amounts of things, and sometimes it's not consequential to the campaign, but they feel that it adds a little bit more flavor or fluff to what they're doing. But this is a way of what GMs do to kind of get a little bit better grasp of their campaign, what they want to do. And they're trying to download everything that they're thinking of, especially the GMs who write too much. They tend to try to download everything onto paper or onto the computer or whatever they're using to transcribe notes. Some GMs do a little bit too little. They think of a lot of things, but due to laziness, like me, they don't get everything down, so a lot of good ideas tend to get lost at times. So some GMs either write too much or too little. A lot of times at this point, documentation is haphazard and undirected. A lot of times you got to make those notes whenever you think of your idea. And a lot of times it's what's coming off the top of your head. At some point in this process, whenever you're trying to get your notes down, also too, GMs tend to start editing ideas out. No, this idea is good, this idea isn't. So they kind of start writing this stuff down and looking at it and kind of assessing it, whether or not they feel it's viable. Sometimes what you see in your mind doesn't translate exactly what you see on paper. And this is kind of an area where major change in your campaign information management can be made. This is kind of the here is the one weird idea thing, like in the ads that you see on the internet sometimes. If it's this one weird idea, it can improve the way you do GMing. So essentially, those are the two steps and processes that you begin with whenever you develop ideas for a campaign. Now, some people tend to mix these two. So some people think, well, I can think about it, but I'll write it down as I'm thinking. So it's not necessarily 1-2. Sometimes it could be mixed up. It depends on the GM. All right. Are there any questions or comments? And remember, take yourself off of mute. Okay, then, I don't think we got any questions or comments, so we'll kind of continue on. So we got the ideas flowing. So here's the one weird idea that you need to consider whenever you're collecting ideas for your campaign. And like I said, a lot of times this tends to be haphazard. You need to start thinking about your campaign documentation as at this point as adding to a campaign database. You need to think about things, whenever you're thinking about these ideas, you need to start thinking about how does this idea fit into a database. This is the point where you need to organize your ideas. And the one thing that you need to do whenever you start organizing, you need to organize this stuff on broad topics. If you're doing a fantasy campaign, you may want to do it on like campaign geography or civilizations and magic and stuff like that. But you need to kind of organize all these ideas into something that's cohesive. I'm a technical writer by trade, and we kind of call this chunking of information. So you want to, start with big chunks of information, but you want to categorize those chunks into something. So make sure whenever you're thinking of your ideas, make sure you start categorizing those ideas. Okay, and 2, be mindful of your campaign scale. A lot of times people tend to treat every campaign equally. Campaigns are large and small. If you're doing a homebrew campaign, maybe for Pathfinder or 5th edition D&D, and you want to make it a grand scale, of course, the information that you're going to have to put into this database is going to be massive. You're going to have to, keep on adding to it. You're going to, do as much as you can in order to establish the parameters of your campaign world. But if you're like playing, like, let's say the Song of Ice and Fire RPG, most of the setting is defined for you, and many of the other things like the different houses and stuff like that. So you need to kind of scale, your database to what you need rather than, try to chunk everything as much as you can into it if it's already written out. Also, too, don't over-organize at this point. A lot of this stuff is coming out. You got your broad categories. Don't try to organize any further. That comes a little bit later. Also, too, a lot of people tend to write a lot of fluff. And as a matter of fact, at this point, all you want are the facts. Like Detective, who was that guy in Dragnet?
Mm-hmm.
You don't know who the guy was in Dragnet?
The guy who played in MASH.
Ah, guy who played MASH. Can't think of his name right now. But you only want the facts. So make sure whenever you're writing stuff. No, huh?
Joe Friday?
Joe Friday, yeah, okay. As a matter of fact, you want to make sure you get as much concise information as you can. As a matter of fact, whenever you write fluff at this stage, a lot of times you toss it out or it's just simply not used. And it's really a waste of your time. And especially, it's a waste of your creative effort and your creative energies. Also, too, give yourself permission to be messy. A lot of people, like myself, are neat freaks. I want to kind of neaten things up. At this point in time, you're just collecting your ideas. You're just downloading your ideas out of your mind and copying them and stuff like that onto paper or wherever you're writing. Be messy with it. Don't mind your spelling. Don't waste time with that. If you're a messy writer, as long as you can read your own writing, that's fine. But don't try to be neat at this point in time. It's counterproductive, and again, it wastes your time. And again, you'll break down those topics, broad topics, and the more specific topics a little bit later. So leave the broad topics alone for right now. Okay, if you're familiar with the concept of a campaign Bible, the campaign Bible is the same thing as a database, like what I'm talking about right now. Essentially, a campaign Bible is a holder of all your information for your campaign, and the databases too. So campaign Bible database, same thing. Also too, and lastly, whenever you're taking notes and stuff like that, use a medium that you're comfortable with. Don't try to go out and buy something that you're unfamiliar with. There's a lot of products out there that kind of entice you with, hey, I can organize your campaign. A lot of this stuff is great, but a lot of times too, it's not like simply writing it down or simply input it in Notepad or Word or whatever you're comfortable with. At this point in time, use what you're comfortable with. Are there any questions, any comments before I move on?
At this stage, for me, I usually have a ton of bullet point lists.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no relationship between some of the bullet point lists, and I struggle a lot to try to organize them in a fashion that's usable later. So you're suggesting I just kind of accept that they're imperfect and move on to the next step?
Yes. A lot of times what you're doing is you're taking the step of just simply downloading all this information. And a lot of times you're just making connections and stuff that you understand at the point in time that seem to make sense to you right now. But later on, what you're going to do is edit down those bullet points a bit and keep the ones that you feel are pertinent to your campaign or are viable to begin with. Does that make any sense?
It does. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And a lot of times too, again, you're just trying to make those connections. So, write down as much as you can and keep as much as you can. All right, I'm going to move on. Is there any more questions, any more comments?
So if we did feel like perhaps learning a new medium, are there some that are, other than Roll20, which I'm aware of, are there some that are devoted to this sort of organizing your campaign?
Um, there are. There's a pretty much a broad plethora of these type of things. One that I use personally is called the Keep, and essentially it organizes your campaign. It offers you um, a text writer and stuff like that. You can put graphics and things into this, and unlike a lot of things, you can actually a lot of products like that, you can actually run games out of it. Another thing to consider too is Microsoft OneNote, which is basically a notebook, a digital notebook, which is very good for actually using as your database and running games out of. But one thing to be very careful about, there are some things like Obsidian Portal, which has a use. Basically, Obsidian Portal is a application that's mainly a database. It's a wiki. It's wiki-based, and but you don't want to try to run games off of it or anything like that. So you have to look around and see what's appropriate for yourself. Okay, and if you're comfortable about anything and you're fairly open-minded, hey, go for it. Does that kind of answer what you're asking?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. All right. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on. So once you've written all your broad topics, and once that phase is out of your mind, out of your system, you'll probably want to start breaking them down into more specific topics. So if you have one of your broad topics is geography, you may want to start breaking it down into like mountains and forests and smaller topics like that. Still be messy with it. Don't be overly concerned with making things nice and neat. What you're trying to do at this point is categorize all the ideas and information. Break it down a little bit and make it understandable to you. And at this point too, like Melissa, brought up in her question, this is probably a good time to edit out some, things that you probably won't use, or things that may not be quite appropriate for what you're doing. Okay. Now, also too, add in the fluff where appropriate, but don't overdo it. So if you're kind of writing about the Misty Mountains, don't write a book about it, but maybe write a little bit that describes a little bit more for yourself. What do the Misty Mountains look like? What's important for them? But just simply don't overdo it. Only write a paragraph at a time. And also to prioritize. You want to write more about what you feel that your players are going to likely encounter. If you're going to center your adventures around the town of, Fartown or something like that, you probably want to make sure that anything around Fartown's fairly well described. But if there's other things that you want to describe that aren't going to come into play, don't go overboard. Don't even write a paragraph about them. Write a sentence or two. But make sure, when you're going to spend your time on what you're going to play. And don't worry about places that are color or, fluff. A sentence or two will do on places like this. Okay, after you've written out most of your specific information, okay, once everything's categorized down and once you've broken everything down, open a fresh notebook, file, or wiki, and then become organized. Write down your information. This is going to be your actual database that you'll use. You want it to be fairly, clean and neat, because you're going to come back to this time and time again to research, come back for the information that you'll research for your adventures, and make sure that everything is nice and consistent. if you can, whenever you're organizing your information, use an outline type of format. Okay, it easily expands as you add, because one thing that's going to happen to this database that you're developing is it's going to grow. As you play your games, in your campaign, players are going to do things, and hopefully you'll be taking notes and incorporating them back into this database. So it's going to grow a bit. If you use a wiki, you may want to go the extra step and kind of create a sitemap so you'll know where all your information is. I have to admit, whenever I use Obsidian Portal, which I rely on a lot for my database stuff, I do get lost with it occasionally. I wrote out one wiki for with one of my fantasy campaigns, and it was absolutely huge. But when it became so huge, it became so really unwieldy too. They do offer a lot of these wiki services do offer tagging and stuff like that, but still you can get lost. So make sure you have a way to access your information quickly. Now, at this point too, you can kind of add in more fluff too. Once you're writing everything out, if you need to add more fluff, describe those misty mountains a little bit more fully, I would do this at this point. Okay? And also, too, whenever you choose a medium that you want to use as a database, make sure it's easy for you and your players to use. Now, there's going to be times when you're going to probably want to share some of this information with your players. One thing that you need to realize is within your campaign, your players are actually pretty much natives of this place, and they need to know what's happening. They need to know, how your campaign is, and what the customs of their peoples are, or something like that. Make sure your players can kind of reference it too. But you don't have to open up your entire database to your players, but make sure that it's easy to use. And lastly, earmark what information you want to share with your players. So, the Misty Mountains may have, mines everywhere that have gems and jewels, but you don't want to give your players the exact locations. So you may not even want to make that, information available to them. So make sure that whenever you're writing your descriptions out, you probably need to consider writing one part out for your players and your other part out for your GMs, or for yourself, I mean. All right. Are there any questions or comments at this time?
I have a question.
Sure.
It's like there are a lot of actual tools out there, but is there anything that's out there to actually help you with organizational techniques? Because you can have OneNote, but you still need to have some sort of approach to organizing things. That OneNote doesn't really do that for you. It seems like it assumes you already know how to do it.
Okay, there's a book out there I do recommend, and I know most of us have heard of it, but it's Never Be Unprepared, and it's written by a guy named DNA Phil, who writes for a blog called Gnome Stew, and another person I think co-authored that book with him. So he was kind of another author that gave another perspective on it. But DNA Phil typically, one of his big things was doing the prep light stuff. And his big technique for keeping himself organized was he would develop a template of information, okay? To keep everything nice and consistent, So maybe his template was, and he pretty much geared it to adventures and stuff rather than just static information. But, he would have a template that would say, description of adventure, what is the counter all about, and stuff like that. But the thing about it is, the technique that you can use is use a static template, and that keeps you filling out the same information consistently. Does that help you, John?
Yes.
Okay. And you can probably have a whole workshop on how exactly to do it, but that's probably a great way to start, because a lot of times what trips a lot of people up isn't the fact that they have the information, it's they don't have the information consistently presented to them. Okay? It's like going from one page of, bullet pointed ideas to another page where, everything's written out in paragraphs to another page that uses numbers and stuff like that. So as long as you can keep yourself consistent, that helps you a lot in kind of rounding up your information. Okay? Are there any more questions before I move on?
Could I give a comment to John's question?
Sure, absolutely.
There are some PDFs out there that have forms to help you get a start, to give you an idea. One I bought a few years ago was by Ronin Arts, and it's for sale on the Paizo website. It's a campaign planner. They have Campaign Planner 2, and Campaign Planner 3. There's a lot of forms that I myself don't use, but some of them are a good starting point.
Melissa, can I get you to do me a favor?
Yeah.
And post the links for that on
Sure.
the meetup site?
Okay, I can do that.
All right, fantastic. All right, any more questions or comments before I move on? And am I going at, oh, well, I can't ask you that. You're all muted. Hopefully I'm going at a speed that is good for everybody. So I'll go ahead and move on. All right. What qualities should a database have? So you're inputting all this information. And the one thing that, I want to kind of preface before I jump into this is that the reason why I'm emphasizing a database so much is simply because a lot of what you're managing is information. A lot of your campaign, is going to, basically generate a lot of information. And a lot of campaign management has to do with managing that information in a way that serves your needs as well as your players. Okay, what qualities should a database have? Ease of use. You want to make sure you can use it, but you want to make sure your players can use it too. It should be searchable. So, no matter what you use, make sure you get down some way of searching through your information, because as your database grows, you're going to have pages upon pages of information that you're going to have to search through. A good example I can pull out from my own experience is the same fantasy game that I was running and using Obsidian Portal. I had actually generated 350 pages, separate pages of entries in my wiki, and it was becoming very difficult to use. The tags helped and stuff like that, but if you're going to use something, make sure it's easily searchable. Maybe you can do like keyword searches and stuff like that, or somehow it should be tabbed. But make sure you do yourself a service and make sure it's searchable. Also, too, if you're using anything like OneNote, make sure what you're using is easy to customize to your own use. Whenever you're doing this kind of thing, you're going to come up with some unique uses. Like with OneNote, there's a lot that you'll bend OneNote to if you use it. A lot of programs or applications out there are already customized. Like I mentioned before, the Keep is a great tool if you're a little bit venturesome and everything like that, to use something that is specifically used for role-playing games. And there's other products out there too, but make sure it can be used, it can be customized to your own use. Okay, now that you have a functional database, there's a few rules that go along with that too, okay? Especially if you're using something like Obsidian Portal or any kind of wiki. Avoid directly using your database to run games. There's a lot of information, and the last thing that you want in your game is dead air space, dead air. While you're trying to look up information, your players are waiting at the table, waiting for you. Instead, use the database to set up all your adventure information. What it is basically your encyclopedia or your campaign Bible, make sure you use it just for that. Don't try to run a game off of it, or you're going to end up searching for more things than you are running your own game. Okay, make sure you take notes in your games and add it to the database as quickly as possible. The strength of having a database is you're capturing all the information that your game is generating. So your players do something one week, you may want to make sure you practice taking notes or doing something. Log that information in there, because the next game, I'll tell you one thing: your players are going to expect the bartender Bart to be named Bartender Bart, and if it's in your database, you can look it up and Bart will appear next week instead of Bartender Jim or Joe or someone else you are making up because you can't quite remember the guy's name. Okay? And also, too, use your database to enforce consistency, and I just kind of covered that. So just make sure whenever you copy your notes in, make sure they're copied in as accurately as possible, and make sure, whenever you're getting all this information into your weekly or bi-weekly or whenever you play a game, you're using it to make sure you're enforcing the consistency. Is there any questions, any comments?
I want to ask you a question. I guess it's kind of from earlier, but do you think it's possible to run a well-organized campaign just on paper?
Absolutely. That's what we did like 40 years ago. You're talking to a guy that's wrote probably most of his campaigns on paper. And as long as you're fairly methodical about organizing, using tabs, doing whatever you can to keep it organized, you absolutely can run a campaign out of just plain paper. Just make sure you get the right tools that you need to do that. Okay. So if you need a binder or something like that, get a binder. Use tabs. Make the information easy for you to access. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Any more questions? All right, I will move on. Okay, how does your database fit into the overall scheme of managing your campaign? All right, one thing is you'll use your database to draw out information and to create adventures for your campaign. So we've kind of went over this, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. Also, too, if you have the option, and if you can, your database can also serve as a common character knowledge information dump for your players. You've written all this information down, and like I said before, your players' characters are native to your world, and you need to let them at least have a little bit of knowledge about what their world is all about. And a lot of times, if you have it written in your database, just let them go to it and get out what information they want out of it. Okay? All right. Also, too, this is kind of way everything will roll. Okay, your database is going to be an ever-growing repository, and it's not going to be not only of your campaign notes, but when your game starts rolling, it's going to be of the players' notes also. Because one thing that you have as far as your campaign, one big advantage, your players tend to be very creative people, and as a matter of fact, your players will come up with things that are incredibly great, and you want to make sure you capture that information. So, you'll go from creating your adventure, which would be the blue notebook, to playing your adventure, which is a 20-sided dice. Then you'll be, logging that information into your database. So whenever that knowledge you're producing is growing, you'll use it to refine your campaign. So the more information that you produce, the more that you can utilize, and the more familiar it becomes to you and your players. So this will be a cycle that you'll get into too. So bear that in mind. So if you get into a good habit, you'll run your campaign, you'll take good notes, you'll put those notes into your database, and whenever you whenever you write your adventures, you'll take the information out of your database, and it'll just simply cycle round and round. All right. Any questions before I go on to the next slide?
Do you think it's really important to have a demarcation in the notes to show that these were player-generated notes, that they may not be canon, but this is your player's opinion or the player character's opinion, just so they know that it's not actually part of what's set in stone, it's just from their character's perspective?
Yeah, I would. I think that's a great point. That's a great point, and you should. A lot of times, your players will have a different perspective. But one thing too to consider too is letting go of a little bit of your own control with that. So if you have Denethor the dwarf, and you really never fleshed out your dwarves culture or anything like that, let your players take that and run with it a bit. As the game master, of course, you're kind of the last editor to this, but again, be open-minded to what your players are willing to offer. That way, you're kind of allowing somebody who has a very vested interest in making sure the dwarves are presented fairly and in a positive light. That someone will be writing well about them, and of course, hopefully, and this is not always the case. Hopefully, you'll get some good information out of it. Does that help you any, Melissa?
It does. I mean, I don't mind mining players' notes or backgrounds for cool ideas and information. I just want to make sure that they know that they may actually have some misinformation, especially if they roll badly in a social situation. Like what their character perceives might not actually be the truth, the reality.
Yeah, that's understood. That's one thing that you'll just need to kind of edit through. Okay, but if someone decides to get rather not verbose, but they want to be rather creative with their character and stuff like that, and give them a cool background and stuff like that, mine that information at all possible. It just helps you out in the long run. All right, is there any more questions? Okay, we'll move on. All right, again, I mentioned scale of effort. Okay, be aware of that too. A lot of times whenever you start out a campaign, you want to do as much as you can. In homebrew campaigns, you want to let your imagination and creativity flow free. You'll be doing a lot of databasing though. You'll be doing a lot of writing on your campaign. You want to make sure all that information is kept, and that's a fairly large effort. And I think anyone who's tried to develop something like that will tell you, if you're going to develop your own setting and stuff like that, that you're going to be, writing and coming up with a lot of information. Now, if you're using a defined setting like Forgotten Realms or Golarion or something that's an implied setting, maybe like a historical setting, like the 20s, if you're a Call of Cthulhu player, don't repeat that information in your database. Don't even take it out of your PDF. Just keep the database to what you need to make notes on. If there's changes with the canon information that you're using, you may want to put that there, and that would probably be for your benefit and maybe your players too. But don't try to repeat information. Don't try to rewrite it again. Okay. And also too, that kind of goes to the third point. Just don't make more work for yourself. Make sure that your database covers all the bases, but don't rewrite. If you're like playing the Game of Thrones or the Song of Ice and Fire RPG, you don't have to rewrite all the houses. The houses are defined in the rule books and stuff like that. Just don't don't make more work than you have to. Okay, also too, use small helpings of information. I know a lot of people, including myself when I was back a young whippersnapper, I used to love writing a lot of things. I loved it. I thought I wrote great. I generated a lot of text. And as I've grown much older and wiser, I realized a few things. Lots of text is boring. Lots of text equals information overload. Lots of text means time wasted. Lots of text is cumbersome. And at the bottom line, lots of text sucks. Moral of the story is, be succinct. Again, if you're describing something, keep it as small as possible. Keep it to a paragraph or a sentence. Or if you're describing like an NPC, use description tags. Beautiful, wears green dress, red hair. You don't have to go in and write half a page on, the serving person at the local inn or anything like that. Just kind of keep it succinct. And that way you can cover a lot more ground and, not burn yourself out creatively doing it. All right, is there any questions so far? Okay. Also, too, consider using the unconventional. Okay. One time, I was very used to using notebooks and stuff like that, and I knew a fellow who actually kept campaign information and ran his games off of note cards. It kind of flipped my mind at the time, but note cards are very handy, and they kind of go along with the keeping your information succinct. There's only so much space on a note card, especially if you keep your note cards reasonably small. Okay, consider that if you're someone who likes writing and using paper. Also, too, if you like using your computer and stuff like that, consider using Excel to organize your campaign. I've heard a lot of great things about people doing that, and not going back to anything else they've ever used. They're just simply using Excel, and Excel in itself is a perfect database. It is a database, and as a matter of fact, so make sure if you're kind of looking for something to use, think out of the box a little bit. Use the unconventional. And if you let me twist my tongue a little bit. So, and also too, whatever you decide to use, make sure it's easy to use again. Not only to you, but if you're going to avail the information to your players, make sure that they're, that they can use it, and everything is simple. We'll go on to questions and discussion. So we're just simply going to open this up, and is there anything that anyone wants to talk about, and any questions, anything?
I was going to ask, when you start organizing your campaign, if you're making your own world, is it better, would you say, to start from where the players start and build outwards, or start from the world in general and go in towards where the players are?
All right, there's a lot of philosophy on that, but I've always had the best luck starting small, starting micro, and building out. There's some disadvantages to it as well as advantages. The advantages are usually it gives you a smaller space a place to start from, so you're not defining as much in your campaign to start out with. You essentially can build out, so whenever your territory expands, you're defining it as you go, so you're building onto your database. Now, the problem with that is, too, a lot of times, whenever you hit the ocean, you don't know where the ocean goes to or anything like that. And I'll tell you one thing, your players will be very curious about that very quickly. If they find ocean or something like that, you better believe in probably 3 or 4 game sessions they'll have a boat, and they're going to use it. If you do it the other way, where you're trying to establish a world, a setting, then introduce your players to it, that's a lot of work ahead of time. Okay, that's flat out a lot of work. But the advantage to that is everything is pretty much defined, or a lot of your world is defined already. So if you put them in a fishing village and they get that boat, you have an ocean for them to sail around in and explore the world. Does that help you?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. All right, anything else? Any other discussion? Any questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
So you're saying to earmark information for players, and also talking about adding players' notes into the database.
Mm-hmm.
Is having all of it together in one database, like, does that make it? I find difficulty keeping all that information together. So what type of things do you do to try to keep them separated? Because I ended up getting to the point where I just have a database for my notes for GMing and a database for player notes, because I couldn't organize it.
Okay. Very, very good question about that. It depends on what you're using as far as your databasing is concerned. If I'll go for the easy first of all, and go from there. If you use Obsidian Portal allows you to make GM secrets, of course, and stuff like that. Information that you can easily hide from your players. Essentially, it's creating an inward and outward facing database. So your inward database is all the secrets and all the notes that you make to yourself, that you keep to yourself. The outward portion is what you're going to allow your players to see. That's the easy solution. As you keep on going, and using different things, one thing that you may want to consider is, again, keeping 2 copies, or publishing, something for your players. That's a difficult one, to kind of think my way through. But that's a great question. Give me some time to think about that one, John, okay?
I'm sorry. I've been thinking about this question a lot recently, so that's why I asked.
No, I'm going to be thinking about it a lot too, John. Thank you very much. But yeah, that's a very good, actually a very good question. So let me put some thought into it. And if I can't get you an answer today, I might put something up on the meetup for later. Okay?
Can I give an example of something a GM is doing in a campaign I'm playing in right now?
Absolutely. Sure.
So he has a very highly detailed database. He's using Fantasy Grounds, which is an online tabletop piece of software, and you can upload information about your NPCs and quests and items and all of that in there, and our character sheets are all in there too. So there's a lot in there that he can hide and that we can't see, but to make sure that we actually know what's going on, at the beginning of the session, he pops up onto our screens a brief summary of what's going on. What city are we in? What are the major quest hooks that we started looking into last time? And just general information like that. On the flip side, I've been in campaigns where GMs were running things more out of either their laptop or a notebook, and they still, at the beginning of the game session, just gave a real quick brief overview, or just asked the players, hey, do you remember what happened last time? And so it's not a perfect access to like their database, their campaign Bible, but at least gives us kind of a quick overview so we know where we are and where we're going, and we don't feel so lost.
Okay, Melissa, can you do me a favor and put that on the chat real quick?
Yeah.
So we'll know, because that sounds pretty interesting, actually. Is there anything else? Any other ideas that anyone has to help John out?
Can I chime in real quick?
Absolutely. This is the time to chime in.
I use OneNote because it's like my go-to just notes for pretty much anything. I kickstarted Realmworks thing that they did, but I've never used it, and I don't know if I'm ever going to be starting to use it. So I found some YouTube links for D&D organization, Dungeon Masters using OneNote, and I'd be glad to post them anywhere anybody wants to or wants me to, so they can look at them. And that's what I go with, and I'm just got to get down to using it, and once I do, I think I'm going to have a good system.
Okay. Now, kind of to answer John's question, how do you, if you do a database or something like that, is there any way that you have it divided between what you know and what your players know, or are you working yourself up to that?
I'm working into that. I know Realmworks has something for like a player view that I was really interested in using, but as I said, I bought it and never played around with it. I should YouTube some videos to find out, but that's me being lazy.
Okay, all right. Sounds good. All right, is there any more questions or anything like that? Anything that you're curious and want to know a little bit more about?
Is this presentation going to be available anywhere?
Yes, I'm going to put this presentation up on the Meetup site, and I'll put it on our Facebook page also.
All right.
And there's a link, I guess it goes to my page. Hopefully people are watching it. Maybe if someone is watching it, maybe they can kind of bounce back an affirmative on the Meetup site. But it will be posted, and you can replay it as much as you want. It's actually becoming a YouTube thing too, so it's a YouTube presentation. So.
Right.
All right. All right. Anything else? I got time for probably one more question. All right, guys. It sounds like we got a wrap here, and I'll go ahead and stop the broadcast. And thank you for attending, and hopefully I'll try to get some feedback from this one and improve the next one. And the next one actually is going to be on February 24th. And it's about finding prospective players. So, if this one helped you, maybe that one will too. So, thank you, and have a good evening.